Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Dipika. Today I'll be discussing about working capital management, which I have already discussed, and some approaches of financing of current asset. So starting with the basic, what do you mean by working capital? Working capital is the sum total of current asset is the working capital of the business. Working capital refers to the firm's investment in short-term asset, cash, short-term security, account receivable and inventory. Next is gross working capital. Gross working capital is the general concept which determines the working capital concept. Gross working capital is the capital invested in total current asset of the business concern. Gross working capital is simply known as total current asset of the concern. Next is net working capital. Net working capital is a specific concept which considered both current asset and current liability of the concern. Net working capital is basically excess of current asset over current liability. That is known as net working capital. It means uh, in this, we will discuss two positive and negative working capital. Positive working capital is if the current asset exceed the current liability, it is positive working capital, and if the current liability exceed the current asset, that is negative working capital. It means positive working capital is surplus of current asset over current liability, and negative working capital is it refers to excess of current liability over current asset, that is negative working capital. Next is permanent working capital. The minimum amount of working capital the company has to maintain in the organization, the minimum amount of working capital has to be blocked in the organization. We cannot convert it into cash during a normal course of business. That is known as minimum working capital, that holding the stock of raw material and finished goods, stator and cash, that is permanent working capital. Next is temporary or variable working capital. It represents the additional current asset required to different time during the operating. It is excess and above over the permanent working capital, that is known as temporary working capital. In temporary working capital, we divide it into two parts, that is seasonal working capital and specific working capital. What is seasonal working capital? Seasonal working capital means the capital required to meet the seasonal demand of the enterprise. It is known as seasonal working capital. Like in season, in summers, there is a demand of cooler, AC. In winters, there is a demand of woolen. So, such industry required seasonal working capital. Next is specific working capital under temporary working capital. Specific working capital is that part of temporary working capital which is required to meet the unforeseen contingencies like strike, flood, war, etc. Next, some component of working capital. Working capital is composed of various current asset and current liability. In current asset, basically, what do you mean by current asset? These current assets are generally realized within short period of time, like within 1 year. So, current asset includes inventory or stock, raw material, work in progress, consumable goods, and finished goods. These are in current assets, inventory of stock. Next, debtors, bills receivable, prepaid, short-term investment, accrued income, cash and balance. These are the component of current assets. Next, current liability. Current liability are those which are generally paid in an ordinary course of business within a short period of time, that is 1 year. Current liability includes creditors, bills payable, accrued expenses, bank overdraft, bank loan, proposed dividend, short term loan, and tax payment due. These are current liability. Next, current asset management. Current asset management basically refers to management of cash, marketable securities, cash equivalent, stock, inventory, uh, account receivable, and other liquid asset. The ultimate goal is to efficiently manage the sources to assure operational continuity, meet short-term obligation, and maximize the profit. The main principle in current asset management is to keep the proper flow of income and liability in balance. Next, there are some approaches to financing current asset. So, working capital financing policy basically deals with the sources and the amount of working capital that a company should maintain. A firm is not only concerned about the amount of current asset but also amount of proportion of short term and long term sources for financing the current asset. There are several working capital investment policy a firm may adopt after taking into account the viability of its cash inflow and cash outflow and the level of risk. First approach is conservative policy. As the name suggests, this policy tried to avoid the risk involved in financing of current asset. Here, relatively high proportion of long-term sources are to be used for financing current asset. The firm not only matches the current asset with current liability but also keeps some excess amount to meet any uncertainty. This is the lowest risk working capital policy and fails to assure optimum utilization of fund. Hence, it cut down the expected return of the shareholder. This is the first policy, that is conservative policy. Next is aggressive policy. It is just opposite of conservative policy. Aggressive working capital financing policy is the risky policy. Conservative policy was safe policy, but this is risky policy that required maximum amount of investment in current asset. Fluctuating as well as permanent current asset under this policy will be financed through short-term debt. In this policy, debt is collected on time and payment to the creditors are made as late as possible. Third policy is highly aggressive policy. First was conservative policy, second was aggressive policy, and the third one is highly aggressive policy. This is highly risky policy for financing the working capital. As per this policy, even some part of the fixed asset is financed through short-term sources. Excessive reliance on short-term policy make this policy very risky. Next is hedging policy. One of the policy which a firm finance its working capital need is the hedging policy, also known as matching policy. This policy works in an arrangement where the current asset of the business are used perfectly to match the current liability. As per this policy, fixed and permanent current assets are financed through long-term sources and fluctuating current assets are financed through short-term sources. This policy is a medium risk proportion and required a good amount of attention. Say, for example, if the bank loan is due to be paid after 6 months, the company will assure that sufficient amount of cash will be available to repay the loan on the date of maturity, even though it may or may not currently have sufficient cash. In case of growth firm, the amount of fixed asset and permanent current asset go on increasing with the passage of time, but the volume of fluctuating current asset changes with the production level. So, these are some of the approaches of financing current asset. Thank you so much.